Hello, and welcome to Afternoon Tea with Karen.
Victorian justice staff to undergo white privilege training. And guess who gets to pay for it? Go and guess. I reckon you can get it in one. A controversial plan to include white privilege training in a new taxpayer-funded, did you get it? All right, that's enough of that. Taxpayer-funded cultural awareness course, which will be rolled out across the Victorian Justice Department, has been labelled woke and divisive. Thousands of Department of Justice and Community Safety staff have been told to undertake mandatory cultural awareness training ahead of treaty in Victoria. Hang on a minute. Hold up. I was told during the whole Voice to Parliament referendum that it had nothing to do with the treaty. And to suggest that a treaty was part of it was clearly misinformation. I actually did a story about this all those months ago, because the Allen government refuses to rule anything in or out of treaty negotiations. And yes, that was off the back of The Voice. Interesting that, isn't it?
Yes, that was interesting. So, a quick reminder for me. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People is the key document which the Greens base their National First Nations policy on. The three core priorities: truth, establish a Truth and Justice Commission; treaty, enact a national treaty and or treaties with First Nations people in this country, sovereign to sovereign; voice, subject to treaty negotiations, establish a national First Nations voice to be included in the governance of Australia as determined by First Nations peoples.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are advised that this program contains images and voices of people who have died.
There needs to be a system in this country where there is equality with the Aboriginal people.
No justice, no peace, no racist police!
We are on the cusp of having treaties for First Peoples of this state.
For decades, First Peoples around Australia have been calling for treaty.
What do we want? Treaty! When do we want it now?
Binding, negotiated legal agreements that would formally recognise that Aboriginal nations existed here for thousands of years, that sovereignty was never ceded, and that grave harm was inflicted during colonisation.
Through treaty, we're getting ready to hand back the decisions about Aboriginal people to Aboriginal peoples.
Treaties might also include frameworks for self-government, political representation, land rights, apologies or compensation.
The main game is sovereign treaty and reparations.
Often promised but never delivered.
There shall be a treaty.
Processes are getting started in the Northern Territory and Queensland, but Victoria has made by far the most progress, launching a treaty authority to oversee negotiations.
The treaty process is now live. We're open for negotiations.
All right, we're good to roll?
My name's Jida Clark. I'm the chair of the Treaty Authority in Victoria.
Well, Jida, what's the significance of this moment for the nation?
Treaty is something our mob have been advocating for generations. It's really about addressing the fundamental relationship between First Peoples and the state. It's about looking at the past, looking to rectify the injustice, but really building a better future, not only for First Peoples communities, but ultimately all Victorians and the nation.
Since 2016, the Victorian Labor government has been inching towards treaty.
New Zealand have successfully done it, and it's time for Australia to step up.
New laws were introduced in 2018.
Walk side by side with us on the path to treaties.
By 2019, Victorian First Peoples elected a group of Aboriginal leaders to guide this process. The now 33-person First Peoples Assembly represents Aboriginal people and traditional owner groups across Victoria. The Assembly pushed for the UNDRIP Justice Commission, a truth-telling inquiry to document past and ongoing injustices to inform the treaty process. In 2022, the Assembly and the Victorian Government agreed on the need for an independent umpire to oversee negotiations.
They established this body called the Treaty Authority, and I'm one of 5 members leading that body. And this body's an independent facilitator, hoping to keep the parties accountable and making sure the process is transparent and that they're playing by the rules.
Jida comes to the authority as a lawyer and senior public servant. The other members of the All Aboriginal Authority include Victoria's first ever Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, as well as a health researcher, a cultural advisor and a professional mediator.
The 5 Aboriginal members are appointed because we're really influenced and abiding by the Western legal system, but we're bringing into the fold Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal law so that the two systems and worldviews can speak and come to an agreement. This is really around peace building.
Now that you've launched, what will be the role of the Treaty Authority?
The Treaty Authority will be overseeing negotiations, will be helping resolve any potential disagreements that come up in the process, and really making sure that they're abiding by what's called the Treaty Negotiation Framework. That's really our rule book. It describes in detail how traditional owners can come to the table and negotiate. It's really about making sure there's an equal playing field.
Historically, it hasn't been, with a long legacy of governments ignoring recommendations from Aboriginal advisory bodies. Ahead of her appearance at the Truth-Telling Commission, the Victorian Premier acknowledged the treaty process is supposed to put a stop to this.
It won't be that same pattern of history, because the way the treaty negotiations have been structured, the way they've been designed, we have that independent umpire, the Treaty Authority, to oversight the work. And so this has been structured in a way to, if you like, break the pattern of the past.
Victoria could end up with not just one, but multiple treaties.
There can be 2 types of treaties that can be negotiated. One is a statewide treaty that will look at addressing probably systemic matters across all of Victoria. There's also local traditional owner treaties that can be negotiated at the local level.
Are you looking at any international examples to see how this has worked elsewhere?
We're also looking to learn from and investigate and research other jurisdictions like Canada and New Zealand to look at their modern treaty-making processes. We want to make sure we're building upon that and really making the most just process and fair process happen in Australia.
At the Vancouver Convention Centre, a ceremony unveiling the city's plan to implement UNDRIP.
Makes Vancouver the first city in Canada, if not the world, to take the UN Declaration and use it as a framework for reconciliation, working with the local First Nations.
The plan was developed by the city and members of the Squamish, Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It includes 79 calls to action and covers areas from affordable housing and revenue sharing to policing, public art and city design.
You know, it's about putting our identity back on the map. It's also about the rebuilding of Indigenous economies, and sometimes that comes with understanding of who we are and understanding that we do have strong nations that want to build or rebuild our economies that once were thriving for thousands of years.
UNDRIP was first adopted by the UN in 2007 and was initially opposed by Canada. But since then, UNDRIP legislation has been passed at the federal and provincial levels. The city began work on this document in 2021.
Every single member in that chamber at City Council is 100% behind this. And so this crosses, every single party in there wants this to happen.
Across the country, Ottawa marked 5 years since another key report, the inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There were criticisms those calls for justice have largely gone untouched.
With the majority showing minimal to no progress, this failure is not acceptable to our people.
But those here say this plan is different. They say accountability is baked in, as are Indigenous teachings.
And the values of Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh have really been the guiding force in how we've developed this, and I think that will continue on into implementation.
This action plan gives us that voice. We're not going through the Supreme Courts of Canada to say that we, Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh, have a right to be here.
The plan will be formally introduced to City Council on June 25th. Michelle Gassoub, CBC News, Vancouver.
So, from the National Indigenous Times, Truth Commission could reset, restore nation's history. This is about resetting and restoring this country's history, said Paul Patton, Federation of Victorian Traditional Owners Chief Executive, to a federal parliamentary inquiry into Truth and Justice Commission bill. The proposed legislation seeks to establish a National Truth and Justice Commission, which would inquire into historical and ongoing injustices against Indigenous people. Mr. Patton said there was scope for the Commission to be a permanent body. Victoria's Youth Justice Commission Deputy Chair Sue Ann Hunter said while a Commonwealth truth-telling process could have a wider scope and examine federal policies, it must take into account work done on a state level. There could be a more joint approach. We could reach more people. We could get more justice, she told the inquiry. Victorian Aboriginal Child and Community Agency Chief Executive Muriel Bambrett said the Youth Justice Commission had not gone far enough. She said a federal truth-telling process needed to examine both historical and contemporary wrongs, and it was important to back up the inquiry with action such as putting redress in place. So, on the Uruk website, this is what they're going to do. Make recommendations for healing, system reform, and practical changes to laws, policy, and education. How it will run the inquiry and the timeline. So back in June 2020. So moving right along in 2021. This is why the nation building thing's so important. It's a UN thing to help them roll out the program. So one of the recommendations from this was to raise the criminal age of responsibility to 14, which didn't pass through Parliament because if children aren't criminally responsible until 14, they can't consent to puberty blockers either. So here's what's happening now, and it will conclude in 2025. And that'll do. See you later. Bye.